Focus for this assignment is the post-Civil War time period. We're going to first start out with these particular terms. You should have an understanding of these terms by the end, the themes from the AP framework, and as you encounter sources, you should be completing this sheet here. We're going to first start out with this particular timeline. At the end of the Civil War, we see the passage of these three amendments, which are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And at the end of the Civil War, up until 1876, the South is fighting for what they call home rule. As you can see, the KKK would emerge around that time period. And the KKK, as well as some of the issues regarding home rule and states' rights, would be problematic for the freed slave all the way up until the Civil Rights Movement. So we're almost at about 100 years if you take the end of the Civil War to probably 1964 with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, where we're going to be dealing with the post-Civil War segregation period. Here we have the three issues that are going to be of concern at the end of the Civil War, because what the South wants is home rule, and as those federal amendments are going to be passed, the 13th through 15th Amendment, the South is going to try to figure out a loophole, and then the federal government's going to have to respond to those loopholes, and they're just going to get caught up in this cycle. If you do not understand the term loophole, a loophole is simply a way around the law, which is precisely what the former Confederate states are going to try to do. The 13th through 15th Amendments are going to be passed, and this is going to be viewed as an example of the federal government trying to overstep states' rights. The star representing the federal government and the people advocating for states' rights are going to try to figure out a way around those particular amendments. Issue number one is going to be lost family. The first document in the AP framework is this one right here. And you want to think about these questions. Does the government have a responsibility to find family members of freed slaves? I don't know if you've ever thought of that about that particular question, but what's going on here in this source is they are looking for this particular individual. Keep in mind that during slavery, slave masters would be allowed to sell family members, and that could be the last time you see a brother, sister, or whatever the situation may be. We're going to transition to a secondary source here, which comes from King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? And I've selected this particular reading because he's looking primarily at families. As he mentions here, we're looking at the millions of people returned to a new form of slavery, and the reference here is to the segregation that's going to emerge after the Civil War. As we look more into this particular document, here he's looking at the father, and in this particular section he's looking at the role of the mother as well as the father that is going to impact family life. In this section of the source, King is looking at the family, and he's arguing that in Africa, that they lived in nature's jungle, and then in the United States, they were subjected to the social and psychological jungle. And his fear is the outcome that he outlines here. And then we can take this section and then see if we could apply it to the vicious cycle. Because remember, King is writing this in the 1960s, but the book does address issues of slavery and the conditions and the long-term impact of slavery as well as segregation. I'm going back to this particular chart here. We're going to start with the small level examples of prejudice and discrimination. I usually think of these like micro, whereas social disadvantages are more macro. An example I'll use here would be like when the military winds up discriminating, that leads to a social disadvantage. This is more of the systemic institutionalized discrimination, racism. This could be an individual, but regardless, both of these when combined lead to a belief in inferiority, and that belief in inferiority is what's going to eventually overturn Plessy Ferguson. Here we have another source, this letter to the editor, and the author writes about numerous people in their family, mother, stepfather. There were 5 of us. 2 died before I left home. And here we have pretty much a letter that's written to the editor that's looking for people. It has been about 46 years since I saw or heard from my people. So it goes back to the question before, does the federal government, does anybody have any obligation to try to help freed slaves find family members? Or is this something that the freed slave has to do on their own? Issue number 2, politics immediately after slavery comes to an end, also known as the Reconstruction era. In that period, we would see an increase of the Jim Crow segregation. And remember, the key here is that those 13th through 15th Amendments that are passed, the former Confederacy wants to figure out a way around those laws, but they really can't because these are federal government amendments. So they don't have to comply unless they can figure out a loophole or way around. The task is going to be to work in teams of 3, split up the readings. Reading 1 and 2 should be for student 1, student 2, and student 3. And you're going to have about 8 or 12 minutes to complete the reading, prepare a mini presentation, and then we're going to set a timer. And what you're going to do is present to the people in your group no longer than 1 minute and 30 seconds. This is just a quick read to look at some of the political issues at the end of the Civil War. We are then going to transition to this KKK documentary clip. You could easily find the documentary from the History Channel on YouTube. And what you're going to do as you watch the clip, the first 15 minutes, is to think about the questions that are here. And I've already mentioned this point, what the South want. For the most part, they're looking for home rule. They want to go back to the period before the Civil War, but they need to figure out a way to do that, considering that they lost the Civil War as well as those amendments that were passed. And we're going to be connecting those amendments to this Federalist debate that has been addressed in previous classes. Now, according to the documentary, one of the things that happens at the end of the Civil War is that the federal government splits up the South into these military districts. And the reason why they're doing this is because they want to make sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are being followed. Here's the way you want to think about this. You have the freed slave, and the freed slave is free. However, they might be under constant terror from the Klansmen, which is why the federal government is going to position federal troops in the South to make sure that nobody can deny this individual their rights. And we'll see how this is going to end later on with the 1876 Compromise. Here are the 13th through 15th Amendments. The first one frees the slave. The 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights. And then the 14th Amendment says a lot here, but for the most part, it's looking at what states can and cannot do. And the one thing that is important here is that they cannot do any of these items. So for the most part, segregation laws are going to challenge this section right here. On this chart, I came up with this graphic. The highlighted items are terms that are in the AP framework. I've already addressed the amendments. The Freedmen Bureau, this was a federal government organization that was trying to assist after the end of the Civil War to answer the question of, how the freed slave was going to integrate into society. Now, the images that I used here, the South wants home rule. We already talked about the military districts, and anything that the federal government does, and I'm probably going to say this a couple times here, is going to be viewed as an example of the federal government trying to force feed legislation down the throats of the former Confederacy, which is why I use this particular graphic here. On this slide, I've taken the terms, the summary, and then I've included the Southern response. For example, the Southern view with regard to freedom is that there is a loss of control over the freed slave. If we look at the 14th Amendment, what they're going to start doing is discriminate in areas of state control. 15th Amendment, all of the loopholes designed to prevent people from voting, poll tax, literacy tests, and so on. The military districts are going to be viewed as an example of a federal government invasion. And that logic would apply in the 1950s in situations like the Little Rock Nine, where they're also going to view the use of federal troops to integrate schools as another invasion. So that mentality is definitely going to hold. Again, it's about the local and state governments fighting against the federal government in their view. We have another required document here, and this one establishes the Freedmen Bureau, and this is an organization that is going to have to be voted on and renewed every year, and that organization is one that's going to try to assist the freed slave, hence the name Freedmen Bureau. When we look at this required source, officers and agents of this bureau will take care that the freedman, freed slave, within their jurisdiction. So that tells us that you're going to have agents who are going to be operating different sections, and then they outline the goal here to provide for the more efficient government of the rebel states. And the rebel states are the former Confederate states. And again, they're trying to make sure that the 13th through 15th Amendments are being followed, and that local, state, government, legislation, and officials are not doing anything to stand in the way of those three amendments. This image is in the AP framework, and it's looking at 5 African American legislatures during Reconstruction, and they're going to be key in trying to develop legislation and policy. Issue number 3, the South achieves home rule. As we mentioned before, you have those 3 amendments. You have the South cut up into military districts, and their goal is to achieve home rule. So how exactly are they going to do that? That's issue 3. One of the issues contributing to the South success of achieving home rule is the Compromise of 1876. Now you want to remember those military districts. Those military districts, we'll just place them right here. And you get to this particular election. And in this election, you have 3 states that are disputing the electoral votes. And when we look at the election and how close it is, these 3 states, if you count up their 7, 8, and 4 electoral votes, those electoral votes, considering how close the election is, are crucial in determining who is going to be the president of the United States. They come up with an agreement, and the agreement is that those 3 states will give their electoral votes to Hayes on the condition that when Hayes becomes president, he gets rid of these districts. And what that's going to do is remove that federal troop, which is going to put the freed slave at the mercy of the Southern way of life. So on this slide, we have the 2 images, the military districts, the Compromise of 1876, and what I want you to recognize here is the federal state back and forth and the loophole. This would be an example of the federal government trying to control the former Confederacy, and then the loophole would be this Compromise of 1876 that is trying to figure out a way to eliminate those military districts. The South will achieve home rule. Why does this matter? Because this is going to lead to those series of segregation laws. Their argument is that the federal government is doing too much for the freed slave. The federal intervention, and this argument goes back to the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate. If we think back about the Revolution, where they felt that the king was overstepping, which led to the Declaration of Independence and the eventual American Revolution, the argument for states' rights and a weak federal government goes back to that particular argument. We want to control our own laws, and in this case, the laws that eventually we're going to be talking about are segregation laws. How to achieve home rule. We already looked at that KKK clip, and we want to go back to some of the examples that were in that particular video. And one of the loopholes that I guess are not legal would represent fear, the fear that could be from the Klan. When the freedman goes to vote, he is going to be subjected to this particular fear. And the goal of the Klan is to reinstate that former way of life for the South that existed during slavery. In this particular example here, we see the voter, and we could find numerous loopholes around the 15th Amendment. The poll tax, the literacy test, all of those are loopholes around those amendments. And the issue here is that what is the federal government going to do? Federal government passes the 15th Amendment. The states then come up with the argument of the poll tax, the literacy test, and so on. And then the federal government is eventually going to have to respond to that to eliminate all of those loopholes, which would allow the freed slave an opportunity to vote. In the Plessy Ferguson court case, we're starting to see a series of laws that are violating the 14th Amendment. And in this particular case, we have a state law that says when you're on a train, you have to get into the cart dependent on your race. And this is going to be challenged in the courts. And what ultimately happens is that the case is going to be about whether or not this violates somebody's rights from a racial point of view. The Supreme Court is going to look at this and pretty much argue that they're not saying you cannot get from point A to point B. They're simply saying that you need to sit in this particular cart. So you still get from one point to another. You know, if they came up with the law that said based on your race you can't get on the train at all, then that definitely is a violation of your rights. And this is going to be federal confirmation that ultimately is going to lead to a series of segregation laws. Also within the AP framework, we have these particular events here that are mentioned, and these events also contribute to the South gaining home rule. In these situations here, we're talking about fear being used as a tactic that lets the freed slave know their place within society. This particular case here is going to look at national citizenship versus state citizenship. This is going to define citizenship differently, where the states are going to have some flexibility in making a determination about what counts as a state citizen. And then this particular case right here, the outcome is that Congress cannot protect discrimination by individuals. And what that means is, let's say if I own a barber shop is definitely different from like a public library, because the barbershop is owned by a citizen. The question here is, can a citizen discriminate? And the answer is going to be yes, whereas on state property, federal government property, that could be questionable because that is a public entity. Conclusion, you want to be able to interpret these graphs, these charts here, and you want to think about that federalist, anti-federalist debate, which has now evolved, and then the South gaining home rule. You want to check your definitions. Make sure you've completed this sheet for the sources. And if you're unsure of the terms, this slide gives you the answers.